Hello and welcome to the Wolf Den Podcast, your home for competitive Digimon TCG discussion and news. I'm your host Nako, joined by my co-host Zenitsu. This week, we will be discussing the results of the PPG Ultimate Cup and our thoughts on the development of the EX03 meta. Listen to us on your favorite podcasting networks. Available now on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon. Link in the description below, or find us at Wolf Den Digimon TCG.
On top of that, we also stream over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, and I upload this in video form on the YouTube channel of Zenitsu.
For our viewer question of the week, this week's question is, which deck would you play to consistently beat Security Control? Many players at my locals meta have picked it up recently, and I want something that will win often enough to maybe convince them to stop.
So I think the first easy question or easy answer to the question is probably Wargray X. Just the fact that the BT1 Wargray, literally from the first set, comes with a delicate plan built in, basically just turns off security threats entirely. And then on top of that, you also have Omnimon X Antibody, the brand new one from BT10. When you digivolve up into it, you just literally get to look at the opponent's security and pick the best card from it and then just say goodbye. So that's going to be one of the easiest decks to want to bring in. But I do understand some of those parts and pieces might be a little bit expensive. So from my personal experience, I actually found blue flares to be pretty positive into security control. They could control all they want. It just doesn't matter just because, well, you have a tamer that just is hiding all of your sources and you just have aggression out of nowhere, which is one of the deck's big weaknesses is just sheer amounts of aggression out of nowhere that it just can't control. It can't stop.
Yeah, anything that can get around the control elements that the deck uses to stop you from doing what you want to do. Any deck that either has, ADP built directly into the Digimon, like the Wargreymon, or decks that can just afford to run 1 to 2 copies of a Delicate Plan, any deck that runs red. Um, I know Melga X experimented with a red base at one point to be able to run that, but that's significantly less consistent. So if you're really going for straight up consistency, it's really kind of something that at least is always red. So Wargrey X, like number one, number two, probably like a Chessmon,
Or
um,
Gallantmon.
or Gallantmon. Just a red deck that can run Delicate Plan, and then
Or
like
burn the security.
yeah, then you get you know into the more experimental, like definitely winning against security control. I don't know, but like I've seen people experiment with throwing in Shivamon into Bloomlord Hydra as a potentially one or two of off mega if you want to just switch that over, just maybe make it the primary focus of the deck or the second mega with Bloomlord trying to end the game and then Shivamon existing also. Um, I don't know, there's a lot you can do with it, but Delicate Plan's kind of your easiest place to start, and then if you want to expand from there into something like Blue Flares where the engine itself is kind of uninterrupted by security controls suite of defensive capabilities.
Yeah, and then there's also just a lot of purple decks like um security control hates recursive value. So if they literally can't deck you out, that's also part of their game plan. So like decks like Commandramon that just do not deck out just because of how your deck works on top of just purple decks that could just reuse the pieces that die. So like there's just a lot of different ways you could go about to tackling security control, and we have to like understand that what security control is doing isn't necessarily trying to win on its own merits. It's trying to force your errors to take advantage of so that way it has an easier time doing anything it wants or needs to.
Yeah, it really is just the deck of kind of compounded unforced errors or potentially forced errors in some ways, but it takes advantage over the longer game span that it wins with to slowly accrue value to the point where you just can't catch up or you just expend all of your resources in a certain way. Um, I know when I played into it with Examon, I I just took my fives and I was just jogressing and then tuck a six, play a six, chaos degradation. Okay, well let's do it again. Tuck a six, play a six, and you do that twice and you're basically out of cards that do anything because for one chaos degradation they got rid of a seven, a six, and then they can Wyvern's Breath or something the other six because it's a little smaller. But um, yeah, there's at least options as far as flexibility in picking something that will like definitely beat them. Like Wargrey X is probably the easiest way to go about it because it's almost a free win, assuming that they actually just see the Wargreymon that has Delicate Plan built into it.
Yep. So that's usually our best experience. And then obviously doing a lot of playtesting against it, figuring out what they're trying to do and how to play around it also is going to help decks that don't necessarily have those built-in answers but actually fight back. Just because, again, they give you a lot of memory to do whatever you want, and they kind of are expecting you to just over resource yourself and over invest in your cards, and then they just punish that hardcore, or they want to.
So, moving on to the main topic of discussion this week. Uh, this last weekend, there was the PPG Ultimate Cup, the first official Ultimate Cup of EX03, where all of EX3 was legal um, since the release of the set. So this is the first data point we have in counting the EX3 metagame moving forward, and I guess forms the foundation of what we will be expecting in the future as the metagame develops.
Yep, so just going over the decks, this is obviously for top 16. It was brought to you by PPG, and in first place, the big winner was Wargreymon X Antibody. Second place, we have Yellow Hybrids with Venusmon. Then third place, we have another Wargreymon X Antibody. Fourth place, we have Metal Garurumon, same as fifth place. Sixth place, we actually have a Mastimon. Then seventh place, we have Imperial Dramon, so two BT8 decks. Then we have in ninth place, or no, that's eighth place,
Yep.
Metal Garurumon X. Ninth place, we have Gallantmon. 10th place, we have Commandramon. 11th, we have another Metal Garurumon X. 12th place, we have Security Control. 13th, Armor Rush. 14th, Mastimon again. 15th, another Armor Rush. And 16th, another Security Control.
So this is a decent spread of decks represented, um, with not too many decks, you know, absolutely dominating the threshold here. The highest one being Metal Guru X with 4, which isn't ridiculous, honestly, as far as what we've seen in the past with decks such as Blue Hybrids being 8 or more of the toppings. Um, so this is pretty conservative spread. I mean, it is early though, so now that we've seen certain decks perform better or worse, we may see some consolidation of people moving off of decks they thought were better or decks that they thought they wanted to try out. Um, there's also a small asterisk with this event because it is an Ultimate Cup, therefore there were mulligans allowed, which may skew the results a little, but on the grand scheme of things, I don't really believe it to affect the data set too much. I This won't be anything like the tournament at the start of BT8 where they didn't allow the starter decks, or the last tournament of BT10 that was BT10 but with restrictions. Those are significantly more impactful on the state of the metagame and what you would expect from the results than something like the addition of a mulligan. So as it stands, this is probably just kind of what we're going to be seeing moving forward.
And the big takeaway is the majority of these decks actually aren't anything like crazy that we've seen before. There's no EX3 decks in here at all. You have two decks that are really taking advantage of the set with Gallantmon and Commandramon, obviously both getting some pretty decent updates and upgrades. And then literally outside of that, everything was like BT 10 and under. And the majority of BT10 cards and usage was actually a minimal compared to some of the other decks. Like there was no true tried and true BT10 deck. The closest we have is Yellow Hybrid splashing Venusmon, and then all of the Metal Garus and War Greymons, or at least a good portion of them, were using the BT10 Omnimon X antibody. And then I think literally outside of that, it was a security control with Grandisol. So there wasn't a huge amount of like change based on these top 16s compared to literally what we've been playing with before.
So I remember you mentioning that in the pre-show, and I went through each of the decks individually, and I kind of categorized them as far as based on their current list, exactly what they're running. Obviously, other options can be used, but if you were to like label the deck by its most recent card, the War Gray X's would be BT10, the Melga X's would be BT10, Venus Hybrids is BT10. Masty is BT9. Masty's so basically the two Masties are the oldest decks here, where they could technically be 100% tournament legal in their current form as of BT9, which is I guess the outlier here. Um, but the some of the other lists here are technically EX3 lists because they include some EX3 cards. The Imperial list specifically, also, Zenitsu didn't mention it, but um, it is a blue-green Imperial. We actually have to say that now because there's another Imperial. So it's the starter deck Imperial Jogress blue-green as we're used to. The purple red one did not top, unfortunately. Um, but it uses a handful of new cards, EX3 cards specifically. um, it uses the jamming Sears Dramon. It's a level 4
That's
that
from
just
that's from EX2,
is
not
it
EX3.
EX2? Wow. Okay,
Yep.
so what's
The
Parasaurmon?
the
BT10?
only it's a BT9 list because the only new addition to the list outside of like anything we've seen was the Splash Tech 1 of Death X, out which was supposed to be the second Imperial Fighter mode from BT8. So outside of that minor change, it is literally an EX2 list.
Animal. Where's Parasaurmon from? BT10? BT9?
No, Parasauromon is like BT4.
No, it's not. There's no
Parasauromon?
way.
I could swear.
Okay, I'm gonna look it up. Zero prep work done in this show. Um,
Oh
it's
no,
a
it's BT6, I think.
6. I could have sworn that
Here it
was the
is.
new one.
It is BT6, the
Okay,
old Parasauromon.
my
So they
bad.
use it just because it's another Stingmon because it's a green level 4 that hard drops for 3 consistently. It doesn't have any abilities, which is like the downside, but like if they're sitting on a floodgate to prevent you from playing Stingmon, like
Okay,
it's
so
just good.
Death X is 9, Sears is BX2. Yeah, honestly, I didn't look for the little number. I just had never seen it before and assumed it was 3. Um,
There is a Parasauromon in EX3. Don't get me wrong. It's
okay.
supposed to go into Bloomlord.
Okay, that's probably also trivia. So yeah, this is actually BT9 list again then. So, this is a BT9 list because of the inclusion of Death X. That counts. Uh, Going back to the list. D Brigade and Gallant are actually EX3, definitely. They use new pieces from the new D Brigade lineup, and they use the new X pieces for Gallant, or not the new X pieces, the new regular pieces for
The
Gallant.
two color pieces, yeah.
Um, and then Security Control is technically 10 because they use
One of them uses
Grandisol.
Grandisol,
The other one I think is
Venusmon.
9. The Is this one 9? This
No,
one's
the other one actually is 9. I
Yeah.
lied.
Yep, yeah, it's 9. It doesn't use Venusmon. The newest card is Death X again. Um so there are some EX3 decks cards represented, but I mean, we all knew EX3, especially outside of its major engines, is a smaller set. So there's not a whole lot of pieces that fit into other meta decks that aren't explicitly built for EX3. So outside of your Gallant, your um, D Brigade, your purple red Imperial, like there's not a whole lot there to for other decks to kind of pick up and use pieces of. So BT10 being the most recent cards from a lot of these decks isn't bad because it's the last major set. So it's the last, power cycling that we would see. So the BT9 lists, I guess, are the outlier again because seeing zero improvement from BT9 to BT10 is kind of new as far as we usually have decks use new pieces, at least one or two of them. So that's kind of an interesting point to note.
And the majority of the decks are only also using only like very small handful of BT10 cards at that.
Yeah, it's
So
just
like
a
it's not
couple
like
ones.
BT10 is having like that huge of an impact. The majority of these are still just for the most part older decks, which really goes to show the strength of what BT9 brought to the table and how powerful all of these like X decks really are. And just even the other types of cards that were added in BT9, because Mastermon did get some pretty decent cards in BT9 as well. And then obviously Death X being Death X.
So I think it says two things, right? It says one that the restrictions were successful in kind of capping the power gain of the set to set movement that we've seen. I know some sets are significantly more powerful than others as far as their relation to the previous sets and their power levels. BT9 was the probably the most egregious we've had so far, but it also seems as though for now, again, you know, reservations to be made for future sets at future dates, um, it's the ceiling. BT10 with restrictions has not power crept BT9, and these results show that.
Yeah, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I know a lot of people just like investing in a deck and then knowing that deck is going to be good for a minute more than literally a hot minute. Definitely is nice, but when like it kind of just starts harming the fact that other decks just can't really exist because they're just that much better. It does kind of put things into a little bit of perspective where it's just like, okay, would Crosshearts have been that bad? Maybe Omnimon or not Omnimon, Alphamon could have been kneecapped for now, but like was really the Crosshearts that egregious to where now there's like almost no BT10 like true BT10 originals actually being represented.
Yeah, there are
And
no
I know there
unique
was
archetypes that were established as of BT10. There are zero in this list.
because everyone was afraid of blue hybrid or not blue hybrids, blue flares, which is blue hybrids 2.0. And everyone was afraid of Grandis, and here they are, zero representation. And I think it's interesting to note that there's also no Grandises in here. That's not
No
saying Grandis
green
couldn't
in
have.
here.
Yeah, that's not saying like Green couldn't have made it in. It easily could have because Grandis just literally is Grandis. But it shows that it is having a harder time making it into these top tables because of just the and even Grandis is just a BT9 deck. But like uh like it's having a harder time just because these decks are utilizing the stuff and mechanic from BT9 to add increased consistency into the deck where a lot of decks just don't have it.
Yeah, so um, it is actually pretty interesting if you break this top 16 down to what is the deck's primary mechanical engine as far as what makes the deck tick, why is it strong, where is it getting its power balance. Um, there are seven, technically nine, uh, X antibody decks here. I guess I'll explain in a second, but just decks that utilize, you know, the X antibody option card, the X antibody mechanic, and Cool Boy itself. Just the power budget allotted to the BT9 X antibody series of Digimon. And even now, like, the quote unquote new additions as far as Gallant X with the new Gallant pieces, kind of shoring up those weaknesses that it had previously, allowing it to actually top an event finally, being, previously the red deck that we made fun of because it kept getting support, but it was never any good. Um, you keep trying, you'll eventually succeed eventually. Um, so, and then the others technically being I have Armor Rushes labeled as Jogress mechanical identity instead of X antibody because the deck is all about Jogressing, but they also use X antibody Digimon in the form of Magna X, though you aren't required to go into from Magna to Magna X, but so it's really seven as far as their primary mechanical identity. Seven X antibody decks represented here. Five Jogress decks in the form of the two Mastamons, two Armor Rushes, and then the one Imperial. Uh, there are two security control decks. I really don't know have anything else to label them other than they are security control. They're kind of their own thing. One hybrid engine and then one rookie engine in the form of D Brigade. I know the deck is more than just Rookie Rush at this point, especially with the EX03 pieces, but it still at its core is a, you know, hard play rookies, swing with rookies deck. So that's kind of where it gets its power budget and the ability to recur its rookies and benefit from having Commandramon in your trash. So
I mean, it does run like 20 to 23 rookies usually, so it's fair to say that it is still kind of a rookie rush-esque deck.
so that's I think that's more telling because so we only had four Melga X's, two Wargray X's, one Gallant X, all these different X antibody decks, but if you look at the greater scheme of just these are the BT9 engines being, added with additional pieces, then it still absolutely dominates the metagame. Um, One step further, just because I had, uh, different data sets. So I counted decks multiple times in the instances where they had multiple colors, but the current color representation amongst the top 16 is 7 blue decks, 5 yellow decks, 4 purple decks, 3 red decks, 1 green, and 1 black. Again, counting decks multiple times when they have multiple colors involved. I only counted 2 colors, primary 2 colors for security control because they can use sometimes upwards of 4 colors if they really wanted to. But it's like what's the foundation of the deck? They're yellow, purple primarily. One of
And
them was
splash whatever
yeah,
color they
one of
feel
them
like.
added some red and one of them added some green, but they're still running 4 copies of Flame Hellscythe, 4 copies of Chaos Degradation. They're they're yellow purple decks. And so the lowest represented here being the one green. There were no green primaries, just the secondary of the blue green Imperial was the only green on this list at all. Um, and the only blacklist minus Alphamon, may he rest in peace, is just the singular Commandramon D Brigade list.
And I think there's 9 different decks represented in this top 16, which is a pretty healthy spread. And I'm curious to see where things are going to develop from here because, like Nako said before, this is just the foundation. This is the start. This is what people are going to be referencing when they're going to be looking at what decks are they worried about, what decks do they need to focus on how to beat. And it's still going to be these X decks. Garurumon is still probably going to be one of the better and safer decks to go with, even though Wargrey did win, just because of just the amount of more positive matchups it has versus Wargrey. And just the different amounts of speed that each of these decks have. I think just using the X antibody decks is just one of the faster things that you could be playing right now. And even though we're not necessarily super hardcore OTK focused, there's obviously more going on to any of these decks than just the OTK, but it still just goes to show that these decks are performing better than anything else. And I do kind of attribute some of that to the kneecapping of Cross Hearts, because that was obviously the big push deck of BT10, and it just isn't represented. It's not good enough anymore.
So one of the things that um, after the event, I was actually just hanging out in the PPG Discord, not in voice or anything, just reading through the discussion, and I learned some key things about this event that I wouldn't have otherwise, and just some additional insights I could share with you all. One of them being that the actual winner of the event and the I originally had thought because I was trying to piece together, I wasn't sure if we would have a true published top 16 prior to the creation of this episode. We're recording it early because of the holiday approaching, but the one of the players had said, oh, congratulations to, for X for winning, and our mirror match was epic and legendary, and so I was like, oh, I actually thought that it was a Wargrey X versus Wargrey X finals. Um, just going through the messages later, I found that it wasn't. It was a Wargrey X versus Melga X, so I'm not sure which player. I could probably look it up on the TCG player stuff, or the Best Coast pairings app. But so either the third or fourth or fifth place player um, was the player that played in the finals and was also undefeated until the final round, and then dropped a couple places unfortunately when they lost the match. But um, the Wargrey X players did play earlier. They played round three, and the first place player won. So the third place player's only loss was to the first place player in the event total. So um, his only loss was to himself, basically, or to another Wargrey X. So that, I guess, is why he is also as high on this list for, opponent win percentage. Um, and then the second place player, the Venus Hybrids, actually didn't lose. They just tied a round, which put them at second place, and also ended the tournament a whole round early. So I guess thanks to him for bringing Yellow Hybrids for that reason, because saved everybody an hour of their time. Um, but I thought it was really interesting that the first place player also had mentioned that they played. I don't know what their match is, so I know their their third round match was against Wargrey X, and I know one of the things that Zenith and I always ask when we see something like something maybe unexpected win an event is okay. Well, what did they play? And did they play against the deck that we expected them to lose against, like whatever? And they played against Wargrey X round three, and then the entire second half of the event, so rounds what 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 5, 6, 7, 8. The last four matches were all Metal Gear X Antibody, and they won all of those.
Which actually is a pretty astounding feat considering I generally am in the perception that it is kind of in Wargrey X's disfavor. I this does come with some personal bias. As a Metal Gurumon X player, I actually think that Metal Gurumon X is pretty decent into Wargrey X. But like mathematically, like thinking out turns and play lines, it really is who goes second is actually hugely favored in that matchup more specifically just because of the math of evolutions and seeing your pieces involved. Garurumon, I think, is a more consistent deck, but if the Wargrey X player just gets into their Wargrey X, there's nothing the Metal Garurumon can do to remove that card, which is pretty sad unless the Wargrey X's stack is bad, but they're not going to move it out unless it's a decent stack. Um, but yeah, beating four in a row is still a pretty good feat. And obviously, usually anyone who's played in these big long events, your first couple of rounds, like rounds 1, 2, and 3, are like the drop phase rounds where people sometimes just will bring jank or bring unorthodox decks and just expect to lose just to get the prizing and leave, but still have a good time while trying to get the prizing. So that could also attribute to the acceleration of these decks wins is they get put into like these little sub brackets and subcategories, and that could help propel your matchups forward.
Yeah, I know. Um, One of our teammates unfortunately ended up in the dreaded tie area after tying round one, and then proceeded to play nothing but slow players and security control for the remainder of the tournament. Eventually, I think ending with three or four ties. I'm not positive how many total. Um, just absolutely mentally demolishing to just play that kind of game the whole day. So shout out to them for their mental fortitude for continuing to play the event after tie after tie. Um, but I know that it isn't exactly in uh, Wargrey X's favor necessarily, especially determining who's going first or not for the ideal lines of play. But I think the one thing that sets these results aside, especially given that we know that the first place player beat Metal 4 times in a row, was that Melga X is the new big bad. And we've seen different decks respond differently to being the big bad. Famously, Alphamon was the deck that everyone was afraid of. Everyone wanted to beat Alphamon, and was very aware of Alphamon's unique like gaps in its protections, and just loaded their decks with those protections or those option cards or those abilities that would get around its defenses. Everybody dropped their DP removal option cards or their DP removal abilities because it can't be DP reduced. Everybody dropped their hard deletion abilities because it can't be deleted. And so now there's, a singular, like, I remember when we went over it at the time that, blue has always gotten the better end of the deal in terms of packages that are analogous between the red and blue. And it was for the first time the red got the better package. It just, blue being able to be more aggressive with it attacks with its 5, not with its 6. So it just kind of operated a turn faster. But I think now is where we see that with Melga X being the big bad, we're just seeing decks getting inundated with bounce again. Just return to hand, return to deck, what have you, and something that Wargrey steps in and is also protected from and takes advantage of these decks that are teched against a different deck.
This also harms like just blue decks in general with this type of protection attached to this body. So who's to say that he didn't play more Imperial players early on and knock some of them down? And this is also attributed to why maybe Examon didn't do super well, even though the evade mechanic is still pretty good. It's just it still can't bounce it, but in terms of like an option, in case they are moving a little bit slower than the Wargrey player and they're afraid that their security isn't going to be as good. So it just it allows the Wargrey player to get a particular like idea on how fast the opponent's deck is moving and use that to their advantage to figure out when and how they need to be playing their cards.
Yeah, so I guess we'll see if so technically Metal X still did win the event as far as,
The most amount of decks
placings,
seen.
most decks seen. Um, if you count total placing score, it's pretty close because the two Wargreys were first and third, with the Melgas being, I
Literally
guess,
being fourth and fifth and then eighth.
fourth, fifth, eighth, 11th.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, they didn't do as well, but top 16's top 16, top 8's top 8, Obviously, especially when you get into this where these people have the same record, they're just different opponents. So it's really, you know, you can't just say, oh, the 8th place Melga X player is clearly better than the ninth place Gallantmon player. Like they probably have the same record. They literally just had different opponents. You can't control who you beat, you know. But
Yeah.
um,
And
go ahead.
oh, and one other thing to note is PPG was using Best Coast pairing, where a lot of the other tournament organizers like to use Arcanine. So they have a different point distribution in terms of how they're awarding these points. So that does attribute to some decks might be able to perform well than others in terms of their tiebreakers.
Okay, just to explain that, because it was actually something that was confusing me for a while, and I remember I was talking to Zenitsu about it. I was like, why are there these blue number ones and green number ones, and what's with the coloring? And I was like, okay, there's win loss tie. Why is it more complicated than that? And the answer is that Best Coast pairings specifically uses a point structure to award points at the end of a match based upon the number of games concluded. So, um, by other tournament organizers' metrics, if you win game one and then fail to finish a game two, declaring the game one winner as the match winner, they get 3 points. By PPG standards, by the Best Coast pairing standards, only 1 point is awarded to the victor. You still get a win. But it's just a green number one, so it's essentially the points of a tie and then the loser is just awarded the 0 normally, but the winner is not given the full 3 points as if they had won the full match. So it means that it kind of punishes the slower decks even more so, because I know even I had a round where my opponent and I were both playing control-y kinds of decks, and we only finished one game and then went to time in game two. So even though I lost the round, my opponent was not awarded the full points for the match.
And that does have a profound impact in terms of how the event is eventually going to be ran because of just the different point differentials that could then be created and how matchups are then paired up. So that is just one important piece to like not saying that the players didn't play well. They all played absolutely insanely well to get to that point. It's just the different tournament organizers use different softwares, so that could attribute to some decks' success over others just because of how the software works and the type of deck that they're bringing.
Um, yeah, so I didn't know exactly where to fit this in as far as like when we discuss it, but um, I know we've been pretty hardline in our stance as far as that we don't see security control as a difficult deck to play, and we usually don't enjoy the players that play it, and we don't encourage people to play it. Um, but I now have, straight from the horse's mouth, one of the players who topped the event was actually discussing the deck in the PPG chat afterwards, and I was jokingly, I responded because I think he made a comment basically just like, oh, like player plays one card a turn, tops event, and I was like, are you being serious? Like, are you self-owning yourself? And he's like, oh yeah, 100%. Like, this deck's actually brain dead. I pretty much have only played security control. I actually am not very good at card games. Like, um, so I don't have the quote pulled up exactly. Do you, does he need to?
I actually do. I have his full statement.
Okay, so I asked
So
for a specific statement that I could then quote him on. So this is from the top 16 player topping with security control.
so he specifically states, I play the deck so much I can say it is 90% brainless. Second sentence says, you make 1 to 2 actions per turn, and those are based on your hand and what you think is in your security. Third sentence is, you're barely drawing compared to other decks. And then his last big statement is, it's all about timing, bluffing, and luck.
So straight from the horse's mouth. We joke on it, but and this is even like there's fun in it because while I don't I still roll my eyes when I play against security control. It does top events. It has continued to show that even in this format, even with this last event. But at least like this illusion that there's this giga brain mental gymnastics going on behind security control. It's just not there. It is one of the easier decks to pilot. It is one of the easier decks to construct. It's one of the harder decks, monetarily, which shouldn't be a factor in consideration really. But straight from the player that by their wording basically only plays security control, it's not hard to play, but it still does well. So if you are someone who wants a deck that is easy and strong, you can play security control and lose all your friends as well.
Yeah, I mean, not saying that like to shift the narrative to be like boo security control. Like it's still a very powerful deck. I think like a lot of its like in the user question earlier, a lot of its relevance is centered around the opponent messing up. Before, it just wasn't actually able to win games and people like stalled out games to hope the opponent just decks themselves out. I think people got a little bit better. Like the reason why it doesn't actually win events is because if you're going up against a good player, they should know how to read and play around security control just naturally, no matter what type of deck that they're playing. It's like, okay, I know how to be able to beat this, and I can adapt my playstyle accordingly. And some players just have a harder time making that mental shift to adjust accordingly.
I think it also speaks to the thin margins by which we differentiate toppings. Like I said, a lot of these players will have similar, like if not identical records, except for opponent's win percentage amongst the top 16. Um,
Yeah, they're usually all like 7-1, so 7 wins, 1 loss in terms of anyone that's not first place, and then usually second place might have like a tie, so it's not like it actually lost, but it didn't win
so,
either.
but basically by that metric, that's why security control is you'll never see it kind of win, or it'll be much harder for it to be in the higher tiers of toppings because a single tie and you're already out of the running almost for, you're already out of the running for winning the event as soon as you tie, and um you are almost out of the running for like being in the top 8 unless you just never lose now. You're like, so the second place player was lucky or fortunate enough at least to only tie once and then win the rest of their games. They did not lose and they got second place. So um that just shows that especially if you tie once with security control and you get stuck into that bracket where you get paired up against other people with ties and you play against another security control player, you're going to tie again. Unfortunately, I've seen the security control mirror, like I've seen it more often, way more at locals, but I mean not the most competitive of situations, but nobody hates playing against security control more than security control players because that mirror is actually obnoxious to even to watch. But um, neither player has any means of ending the game, so you just tie, and then now you're like two ties and you're almost decidedly out of top 16. So that's really where this information is coming from. So if you want something that you can top 64 consistently, we never really see the full, depth of the data. We can never get to go through the whole list of events, like what's the total top 128, top 64. I would love to have access to that data, but not a single tournament organizer provides that for us.
I think we saw it a total of
It was
once.
literally once,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, and that was about it. And I think it wasn't necessarily a thing they did on purpose. It was just let's just throw this out because we need to throw it out.
hmm
Um, but regardless, like what this data is showing us right now is Metal Gurumon is still going to be the best deck to play and prepare against. And a lot of these BT9 X antibody decks are just that strong. I'm actually kind of happy that Gallantmon is on here, even though he didn't top 8. He just barely bubbled out and he got ninth place. Just the fact that there is still some ability for the other X antibody decks or decks that are incorporating EX03 to be able to do well is nice. Uh, who's to say that next event, Bloomlord won't be able to top? It just really depends on a lot of like a whole bunch of various factors to go right in order for you to be able to propel and accelerate your deck. And as we saw with the War Greymon player, he just farmed the blue Garurumons. But that's not going to say like, oh, if he played a fifth one, would he have won that fifth one? It just showed that he was familiar with that matchup. He was comfortable and good with it, and obviously did very well into those. So make sure to get as much practice into probably the number one deck that you think is going to be there, and make sure that you're going to at least be prepared for that number one, which is usually how a lot of these metas we generally tech for, is just knowing what that number one deck is and be able to adapt our deck to be able to beat it. And I think this was just a pretty good meta call on reading that it was Metal Garurumon, and it looks like it is Metal Garurumon.
Yeah. I know we've mentioned it in the past, like Zenitsu basically just mentioned, but um, it's basically the biggest argument for playing, not the necessarily big bad. Like, so statistically, still the best deck for this event was Melguru X. It had the most tops, the largest represented amongst the top 16. And I at least know from my personal experience playing in the event, I played against two of them. I didn't play against a single Wargrey X. Um, but that being said, there are some challenges with being the best deck. Is that it's easier to tech against you, and people will tech against you, and people will practice against you, which is so. I mean, I'm not sure the exact suite of what one practices against if you are the best deck. What either your best matchups, your worst matchups. you have to divide your time between what do you think you're going to see that isn't yourself, that isn't just the mirror, which you should be very familiar with if you're playing the best deck, but it allows everybody else to plan for you and you not necessarily to be able to plan for them, because as a Melga X, you have to be prepared and able to completely play out optimally as best you can what Wargrey X, Bloom Hydra, Examon, by this metric, Mastamon, Security Control, and they all play, in some ways vastly differently. I mean, I don't really know what Melga X does versus a Wargrey X that they wouldn't do versus a Bloom Lord, or what they wouldn't do versus a Security Control. But I also don't play the deck. But um, if you are the Wargrey X player, you are the person who's playing, not necessarily the deck that people are expected to play against. You have that slight advantage as far as people may not be familiar with what my deck is capable of, and that wins you games.
And even just looking at the meta as a whole, like a lot of people just are slightly defaulting to good security threats to try to kill Metal Garurumon X. More in the case of security control, but like Imperial Jamon having Megadeth and Armor Rush also having Megadeth. You have Chaos Degradation on Mastimon side. Like, there's just a lot of security threats that's in this top 16, and none of that matters to Wargrey, which again helps propel itself forward as a good deck to take in this, or at least it did propel it in this type of event where it's just like I have a good Melga X matchup, and when I don't, I could just easily body anything that's relying on their security to just try to win the game. So, like, there is just a lot that goes on into your capability to be successful at these types of events, and reading the meta, knowing what the best deck is, being seasons and practiced all definitely help attribute to that.
So the next step, I guess, as far as this is what happens when the meta gets completely turned on its head. The BT10 power level has been kneecapped. We are dropped down to there's no cross art supremacy. There's no Alphamon, not so much, I mean, obviously not a BT10 deck, but there's no Alphamon running amok with its 17 different protections. And this is what we get in that instance. So, seeing this, seeing the continued rise of Melga X, the continued presence of Melga X, but the strong addition of the Wargrey X's, the Armor Rushes, the the Gallant. These decks are decks that now people have at least a snapshot of what to prepare for, whereas before we were guessing. Many people were saying Bloom Hydra, many people were playing Examon. Just they're not represented here at the moment. Not saying they won't be. I still think both of those are very strong decks. And at least
Yeah,
I know of people who are playing against them too.
there's still just a lot of playable decks that eventually will end up getting their own top 16s, but this at least just gives us a base foundation to go off of in terms of actually getting a read on the meta, because this is kind of a wild west where we didn't exactly know what to expect going into it, which made this a little bit harder of event to want to tech and get a read for. But there's still just a lot of plethora of different viable options in terms of like playable decks that could be represented, because Jessamon wasn't here at all. I think Jessamon is still a good deck. Like you said, Examon, Bloom Hydra. Um, Blue Flare still has the capability and potential, even though it's really bad into single stack decks, which is basically everything that was BT9. There's still just a lot of space for development, and we have a lot of time for that development to happen.
Yeah, and as the meta starts to stabilize, so we'll move from this initial um, kind of guesstimation phase where I don't know exactly what's good into what. I don't know exactly how certain matchups develop, and I don't know what people are wanting and actually bringing, because ultimately that's all a meta is. If everybody wakes up on the day of the event and you know a a letter flies through their window and they unwrap and it says play Mastamon, and all of a sudden Mastamon's 8 out of the top 16, you can't prepare for that because everyone's playing Mastamon, Mastamon will top. Or if everyone's playing Metal X, Metal X will top. So it ultimately comes down to what are people playing, and then what are people winning with once they're all playing it. Now, obviously, if everybody just decides to play security control, and then the top 16 is just 16 different War Gray X's, we know what happened there. But um, this is where we see kind of the iteration and consolidation phase, as I've usually referred to it as, for my purposes. And so before people guess, right? Like, I think this is a good deck, or I've heard this is a good deck, and I've played this deck, and I think it's pretty good, and I take it. And now, you cast the widest net at the beginning of a format, unless there's, a potentially one best deck in mind, but there wasn't necessarily this time. And,
And
oh, go ahead.
oh, go ahead. No, you first.
I was just gonna say we just move towards, the uh, iteration and consolidation. So I thought Melga X was the best deck, but I thought Bloom Hydra was really good into Melga X. I was very confident in that matchup, and I just played in the event, and I lost to Melga X twice. I mean, I didn't personally, but example. Um, and there are 0 Bloom Hydra represented here, 4 Melga X. I return to the drawing board, but what I do see is, oh wow, like Armor Rush. That's pretty interesting. What are they doing that's allowing them to beat Melga X potentially? Or how does the Melga X versus where Greymon matchup go? And you learn, you look into these decks that are topping, and or even like the Blue Green Imperial, like, oh, where'd that come from? I thought that deck was dead. What new pieces did that deck get? And then you look up the list, you see you figure out maybe why it won, and then maybe you swap. Not necessarily because you have to, but many people want to. Instead of you know, we don't have that much time to build and develop these decks in the card game. Obviously, this format is going to be a little longer than most, but it'll be much more likely for somebody to switch to one of these decks than to try and develop their own game sense with whatever they brought that isn't represented here.
Yeah, and rapid iteration is usually a good thing. That's kind of where I was gonna go. With that, just learning to be able to adapt really quickly is a very crucial strength, especially when sometimes these events are back to back to back. So, just this like month, we had Core, which obviously was BT10, so that doesn't necessarily count. But date wise, it was literally 1 week ago. Then we just had PPG, and now this coming weekend we have Top Cut, and then we get a little bit of a break and reprieve. And in December, it looks like we only have one event as of right now, which is going to be the Play TCG event. And that's going like during that break is probably where there's going to be the most amount of changes because we have more time to be able to iterate on our decks, on our playstyles, and where we think the meta currently is based on the previous event.
Yeah. I have I have seen it referenced before that one of the negatives of the North American meta, the English meta, is that we are far more likely to ditch what we think we like or what we actually like in terms of something that we think will be more successful. Um, at least far more than the Japanese metagame does, especially because they usually operate at a locals level. So I feel less punished bringing my Mastamon deck to locals and maybe losing a round or two than I do losing to just 3 Melga X's in a row in Ultimate Cup or something. And so we usually do kind of fall into a pretty tight top end of a couple decks that people think are good or that are good into each other, and that is where I think for this next event we're going to see a lot of that. We're going to see fewer total different decks taken, a lot more consolidated towards these decks, or even just the couple decks that just barely missed this list. Um, I think I remember seeing that like the highest Bloom Hydra list like was still top 32. Maybe it's like in the 20s. So it's there. It definitely can see success. Examon as well. Um, but just the lists didn't see success on this day. Ultimately, unfortunately, a lot of the success of a card game does depend upon, draw RNG and opponent RNG. So while we still see a lot of the same players topping events due to their, you know, just being able to beat their opponents with the tools they are given, um, everybody draws poorly eventually, and then you just lose a round, and all of a sudden you're out of this list, and we're not talking about your, you know, top 32, still did very well, still very proud of yourself, um, in the event, and your just list isn't mentioned.
Yep, and not even the lists that are mentioned that would have had the same like win-loss record as some of the decks that are in top 16 but barely bubbled out due to like opponent match due to their opponent win percentage
Yeah,
and tiebreakers.
I mean, if you were someone like myself who in an early round I played against an opponent who just kind of popped in and said, "Hey, I'm just here for the prizing. You can just mark down that you won," and then leaves the call. Like your opponent win percentage is going to be lower because that person isn't winning any matches. So, um, you you could literally win the rest of your matches minus maybe one that you lose to something and bubble out of top 16 for that reason. So, um, it's in the nature of the card game, and we just kind of do the best with what we have as far as our analysis of the data.
Yep. And by no means does this mean that the format is already solved. We're just beginning, and there's still a lot of room for growth and exploration to be had. And I'm curious and interested to see how this is actually going to end up to develop.
Yeah, if anything, it's the opposite, right? Like, this is, as we've said, this is the starting point. We have the next couple months. We have until BT11 comes out in February for this meta to continue. Um, Assuming no additional changes are made via the ban restriction announcements, but uh, based upon the information we have as of this moment, this is what we have, and maybe we see some changes because I mean I know I was surprised that a yellow hybrid deck is here at all. I had completely written off the deck with the restriction of Jet Sylphie and the restriction of Sunrise Buster especially. Those were two very prominent cards in the BT10 iteration of Venus hybrids. And so the fact that this player found success with it, literally going undefeated minus their one tie, um, is something to be explored as far as are other people going to pick up Venus hybrids? Because it was the deck that kept Melga X out of the Japanese metagame because it's by far Melga's worst matchup.
Yep. Just because Venus Mon's ability to just turn off your abilities is pretty huge, especially since attacking into it is also off the table. And yeah, it's not necessarily in Guru's favor.
Just also the specific option suite they use for removal that goes around Melga's protection if they DP minus you in any way. So Sunrise Buster is off the table outside of the one of, but that was just very tempo efficient. You can still run Eden's Javelin or Wyvern's Breath as if you really need like large removal. Um, but even something as an Eden's Javelin would usually get over a Melga as far as to just DP minus the stack down and kill it without it being able to protect itself.
Yep.
Though also, that being said, I mean this just shows the complexity of the card game and the metagame that we have because Venus Hybrid doing well is something I might want to try, but if I know other people are going to all be picking up Wargrey X, I don't want to bother because that's an easy loss.
Based on the market, I definitely think people are picking up Wargrey X.
Yeah. I mean, I think it winning the event and being third place like is going to be the headline, right? That's what everyone's going to walk away from this event with. Melga X had four. Yeah, yeah, we all kind of expected that. But two Wargray X and one of them won, and they beat four Melga X's in a row. That's the headline. That's what people are attaching to. Oh, and also there was a Gallantmon. That was really cool. Shout out to that player for winning with that.
Yep.
But so um, hopefully we get some development in the next tournament, and we'll see where people take this and where it goes.
Yep. And I'm pretty uh as much as people like to doomsay on the lack of cross hearts and the ban and restriction, I think ideally it was for the benefit, just so that way we could try to have a better EX3 format as a whole.
Yeah, I felt good about the event, and I felt as though it was fair. And even though I played into, yeah, I think two of my two of my 5 rounds that I played were Melga X. I still it's not a great matchup for me, but I never felt like I lost by them flipping their egg and knowing that I was playing against Melga X.
Yeah, it definitely is a lot closer in, like, a lot of these decks are a lot closer in power than people think, even if it is a lot consolidated into BT9.
So that being said, that's all the time we have for today. I thank you for joining us through the completion of the episode. Make sure to leave a comment if you guys want to add anything to the viewer question of the week. We kind of go through those to see what we want to use for the next week's episode. We usually don't get a whole lot, so there's a good chance that if you do ask a question in the comments that can be answered in the viewer question section, then we'll be able to accomplish that. Um, but other than that, enjoy your holidays, depending on when you're listening to this. And we are out.
Peace.